Okay, dear colleagues, dear students also, I would like first to thank very much the Historical Forum and the University of St. Petersburg for being here. It's my first time to St. Petersburg, and well, of course I have known the Hermitage for such a long time ago. I was so pleased to discover it and to discover the beauties of the city. So I'm going to speak to you about a topic which to my mind is a very important one, even though it's not the way that theoretical museology is conceived, I would say. And somehow the idea of connecting geopolitics and museums is pretty strange, even though geopolitics started to be really fashionable again a couple of years ago. So, as I guess for you and for most of you, the term geopolitics, you might be not so familiar about the term geopolitics. I will start with a brief introduction of what is the notion behind this and how we could connect it with the museum world. For a long time, I had the impression that, of course, museology was evolving from the museums sector. And more I'm convinced that, of course, museums are not evolving from the other and just from the museum history, but of course, it's a conjunction of a lot of different parameters. And that's geopolitics. I mean, what is behind this term could explain a lot of the way we could conceive, especially the present situation of museums around the world, but also their future. The future for me of museums is very important because you realized that during the last years, the museum sector evolved a lot. And I'm afraid it might change also again a lot during the next decades, but we will speak about it a bit later. So, I will start with a brief definition of the term geopolitics that was given here by Yves Lacoste, who was the man who introduced again the term geopolitique in France during the 1980s. In its strongest stance, the word geopolitics refers to everything that concerns rivalries of power and political influence over territories and therefore the people who live there. Geopolitics is therefore the whole of observations and strategic, geographical and historical reasoning that make it possible to better understand conflicts. You understand that actually, well, the term conflicts and the term rivalry of power is central to the idea of geopolitics. But it's also, this is the first notion. The second notion is of course linked with territories and with geography. It means that geography and a kind of geography of power is very important to understand what happens in our world. What happens in our world, what happens in each country. You know that each country was dedicated to improve the health of its citizens, I would say. Well, this is actually the idea that is behind the Wealth of Nations that was written 2 centuries ago by Adam Smith. The Wealth of Nations was the liberal way of improving the wealth, the richness of people of each nation. But of course, in order to improve the wealthness, the richness of people, I would say the national gross product, to speak in economic terms, you have the possibility of working with exchange, with business, or with war, plundering and invading countries, etc. And somehow you could have in mind that each country wanted for the best of its citizens the possibility of invading some new territories, provided they could offer some better economic profits or better economic wealth, or better wealth in general. During a long time, this story was the story somehow of wars, but story of regions in the world. During the last decades, the world started to shrink because of new technologies, because, of course, of all of the industrialization process. The world starts to be, of course, just one single world, and not one Chinese world and one Indian world that were closed world, I would say, during the whole antiquities, etc. Of course, now, when we think about one country that would like to dominate the world, of course, we think about one world and not a separate part of the world. The interesting point of geopolitics is to put everything in maps. And I think that if you look at maps, it always gives you a very good idea of what is behind the different relations that you could observe and the different positions that you could observe in the world. This is just a map on US military bases abroad, and it gives, of course, a lot of information about the intentions of the US in order to dominate, I would say, and rule the world. For my mind, of course, we are living in the Pax Americana, which means, I mean, the American way of living. And of course, America the United States, of course, want to continue to rule generally the world. Of course, each period had its dominating power from the antiquity. I would say maybe sometimes from the prehistory, but I will start from the antiquity. During some centuries, for what concerns the eastern part of the world, at that moment, of course, you know, of course, that Rome was the biggest empire that ruled the world during 4 or 5 centuries. At that same moment, there was another world, I would say, that was in China, and it was also very important. For what concerned the western part, of course, Rome was the wealthiest, the most important. India was also very important, but at that moment they were very much separated. Of course, during the 18th century, 2 dominating powers were in conflict somehow, well, more and more, but especially 2 dominating powers. At the beginning of the 19th century, of course, you would remember of Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. But of course, after Napoleon was defeated and France was defeated, a part of the first, of course, French Empire collapsed. France, that was at that moment the wealthiest country in Europe, started to decline on the profit, of course, also of the starting to be industrialized country, which was Great Britain, and which started what was called the Pax Britannica, which means that during at least 1.5 centuries or something like that, Great Britain, with its empire, started to try to rule and to dominate the world. At that moment, of course, Europe, the old Europe, was at the centrum of the planisphere, the world, and expanded all of its influence, and of course also at that moment expanded also the idea within the Enlightenment, and just after, during the 19th century, which was called the century of museums, the idea of different institutions, and among all of these institutions, the museums. But of course, I will come again later. After the First World War, and especially after the Second World War, United States, that had become at the end of the 19th century the wealthiest economic power, became, after the Second World War, in conflict with USSR, and of course the two, what was called the Cold War moment, the dominating power. 50 years more or less of that period, and in the 90s, what Francis Fukuyama supposed to say the end of history. Of course, it was not the end of history. It was, at that moment, an idea that United States, and it's very interesting also to see it in the American museums, they had the impression and they felt the responsibility of ruling alone somehow the global exchange of the world system. But, of course, the history was not finished and continues with the starting in the emergence of other powers that were called the BRICS, such as Brazil, India, of course, China, Russia again, of course, and South Africa, that represented 42% of the population, and that started to emerge as a potential superpower also, just together somehow, but trying to behave like an alternative to the Pax America that was profiled and that ruled somehow also the 20th century. Of course, the future is centered in Asia more than other parts. This is a map that was produced by French newspaper explaining that, of course, if from France we are still looking as France as the centrum of the world, you know that French people are very arrogant. You might realize also that, of course, the world is moving outside of France, and of course that even outside of Europe, there are some bigger and bigger countries that actually do not look anymore to Europe as the center and do not look at the Atlantic Ocean as the centrum of the oceans, but the Pacific ones, and of course at the centrum in the years 2050 should be definitely much more linked with China, India, and etc. All of these conflicts, all of these evolutions explains also a lot of positions that are taken now, of course, in order sometimes to change that or to try to keep the things as they were, of course. And some countries would like, of course, to be kept as they are, and some countries would like, of course, to change the things. The idea of geopolitics emerged with the idea of geography and with the discipline of geography in the 19th century. The first person, to my, as far as I know, who was named in the German university geographer was Friedrich Ratzel, who had in mind the idea that, of course, geography was a very important discipline in order to think about, to prepare the war also, and to prepare and to think about the possible growth of a country. He was conceiving countries in a kind of biological form, and for him he invented the term, the Lebensraum, living space, in order to show and to explain that Germany had to expand itself in order to have enough space in order to live. Of course, these stories, this discipline of geopolitics started to be very popular during the beginning of the 20th century, but above all, during the Nazi regime. And there were huge departments of geopolitics in the Third Reich in Germany, but actually also the idea of geopolitics, because it was so much associated to the Nazi regime, collapsed after the Second World War also because of that. But the idea of geopolitics was not, of course, only linked with Germany. There were, of course, some other thinkers from abroad in Great Britain and in the United States. In Great Britain, the most important one was Halford McFinder, who also was the first teacher, as far as I know, of geography in Oxford, and who introduced the idea that if you want to rule the world, and at that moment, in Great Britain, the idea of the Commonwealth and the British Empire was to dominate the world. If you want to continue to rule the world, and at that moment, of course, there were frightenings from both United States, but also from all of the parts in Eastern countries. If you want to to rule the world, you have to concentrate on what he called the most important part of the world. It was the world island, which was the Eurasia, Europe and Asian continent. And actually, if you wanted to keep the heartland, the heart of the world island, you had to keep the rimland, which was the ring between Europe and the heartland, which was, for instance, all of the eastern countries in Europe. It's exactly at that place what you know, as you know, that there were the conflict started in the First World War and after also in the Second World War. This idea was, of course, very important, and if you have in mind still this card, this map, it's very interesting to see how somehow, I wouldn't say actual, how contemporary it is in order to explain some of the actions that are taken against some countries, etc. So, as I said, geopolitics started to be really old-fashioned during the 50s and the 60s and 70s. But in the 80s, for instance, in France, geopolitics started to be fashionable again, and it was launched by people such as Yves Lacoste, etc. Now, there are people who are explored. There are institutes of geopolitics in France. There are also institutes of geopolitics all around the world, of course, and it might be called from another way, but they explore this idea of geopolitics. Of course, it might be used in order to understand natural resources or geographical and interesting conflicts for political reasons, but also, if you concentrate, you can explore the situation of sports through geopolitics, and of course of languages, French language, the influence of French language, for instance, which is very important, but also definitely all of what would be the natural resources that are used in our world for industrial reasons. For instance, of course, oil. The history of oil is, of course, the most important, one of the most important history in order to understand why some people invaded some countries, etc. And all of the different conflicts during the 20th century, at least the second half of the 20th century, and unfortunately also the beginning of the 21st century, could be also, of course, linked with the resources for oil, because our industrial civilization is built on oil, as you know, on oil, on gas, on other specific natural resources that are used for new technologies, specific minerals, etc. And of course, if you just observe all of the places where you have some exports of these natural resources, you could see also that they are definitely linked with important conflicts and important zones that are conflicted by different countries. It's like this with oil. It might be more and more like this with water and other natural resources. As you know, because of global warming and the climate change, water might become a very important factor during the next decades, which means that some of the conflicts will be explained also because of these specific clean resources such as water. So, now let's start to explain this way of seeing things for what concerns the museums. I'm very much interested by the evolution of the museum sector and the number of museums. It's always for me a kind of mystery to know and to try to discover the number of museums in the world. Actually, we have mostly no idea about the number of museums in the world. The fact is that UNESCO nor ICOM do not have any idea of how many museums there are. Even in USSR, even in Russia, even in United Nations, etc. During all of the 20th century, it was very difficult to know the number of museums, because actually the idea of the museums itself changed. So it might explain one of the reasons, but also each country does have some specific statistical way of recording its museums, which means that actually nobody has a good idea of how many museums there are. So I would say somehow that all of the statistics are false, but at least they can give an idea of the evolution. The normal figure that you would meet in the literature would be about 60,000 museums. But if you just look at United States, in most of the statistics, they counted something like 16,000 museums in United States, 16,000. Actually, the number, they changed the way of counting the museums. And from 16,000, they passed to 32,000. Just 32,000 museums for United States. The interesting point is, of course, that there were mostly no museums, or what could be called museums, in the beginning of the 19th century. Before the opening of the Louvre, there would have been more or less 30 public museums in the world, open to the public, etc., etc. More or less, these are the statistics. And then, of course, they started to grow, and there was a kind of exponential growth in especially the 60s and the 70s, and it continued. But, of course, if now the museum phenomenon is supposed to be disseminated all around the world, there are museums in each country of the world. But of course, some countries have a better network of museums than other countries. If you look at what ICOM says, they say that you have, I think, something like 130 committees, national committees of museums. Russia is one of the national committees, but you have also a committee for Venezuela, Bahrain, Belgium, etc., etc. And they have 130 national committees. But of course, all of these national committees have different sizes. And some of them are very, very small. Some of them are pretty big also, of course. The museum phenomenon, and this is an interesting point, started somehow exactly on the same places, I would say, and developed on the same places as capitalism. This is a kind of hard hypothesis that I would like to make with you, is the fact that actually the more the economic system is developed, the more the richest the country is, the biggest amount of museum it will have. One of my PhD students who was from Korea made a very beautiful evolution, and it compared the evolution of the gross national product, you know, the statistic that is used for to evaluate the richness of a country, and he also compared it with the number of museum, the growing of the museum. And the growing of the national product and the growing of museums were exactly the same. Exactly. The two lines were exactly on the same size. And somehow, when you see the evolution of a country, you see exactly after some years the same evolution with the number of museums. which means that, of course, during a long time, the idea of the museum was spread also with the capitalist countries and started to develop from Italy to France and to, of course, especially in Germany. During all of the 18th century, all of the cabinet of curiosities, because at that moment, of course, there were no museums in the real sense, although some authors spoke about museums, but of course, all of the cabinets were especially located in Italy and Germany, or the countries of Germany, because of course there were different countries, etc. But the point is that, of course, the evolution of museum continued like that, which means that at the end of the 19th century, when America started to become the biggest and the richest country in the world, a couple of years after, the number of museums was multiplied, but also 2 decades later, I would say 20 years later, actually, the idea, the way of conceiving museums, of thinking about museums, started to develop and to grow with real museologists, of people who were thinking about new way of considering museums, especially the American way of conceiving museums, with people such as Benjamin Gilman or George Bongood or John Cotton Dana. It's this man who were thinking really differently from Europe, started to spread out and to be listened even in Europe in the 20s. So in the years 1920s, more or less 20 years after America started, United States started to become the richest country, the ideas of considering a museum, which was more linked, for instance, with the people and education and the feeling of education, etc., were spread out. But actually, when you see the emergence of a new power, you see also at that moment that the idea of museum and of conceiving museums started also to emerge. It means that in the 19th century, before the Americans, of course, there were especially 3 countries that were having some strong ideas on the museums: France, but especially Germany, and Great Britain, I would say. But then, of course, during, after the First World War, after a small time, you know that the change of regime brought some new ideas, and the emergence of a new way of considering museums, the development of the museum networks in USSR or in Germany at that moment, especially during the Nazi regime, was very important. It means also that at that moment, especially from Russia, but as far as I know, but of course there are some specialists in the room, so I would not dare to say too many mistakes, from the Tsar regime, from 100 more or less museums at that moment until in the 20s, in the late 20s, in the beginning of the 30s, the network was about 400 museums. At least these were the statistics that were given by the Soviet regime in order to show that the Soviet regime was really wealthy and was able to offer to all of the community a very important network of museums. What is interesting is to see that after, in the 1980s, after Japan became the second richest country in the world during a certain period, the museum phenomenon started to emerge and to develop very strongly in Japan, with especially a specific idea and feeling on architecture. It's from that moment that Japanese architecture started to boom, and that Japanese museums started to be very well known, especially for the architecture, but also, I would say, and I would add on the specific way of presenting objects, etc. And then, of course, now after 15 years of a huge growth with Chinese museums, you know, are started to expand a lot. In 2010, there were inaugurations of one museum each day in China. So the museum network from China is now about, I think, more or less 6,000 museums, or at least. Some of these museums are, of course, absolutely huge, with hundreds, well, thousands and thousands of square meters. Some other ones, this is the technology, with, of course, beautiful and new extravagant forms of architecture, as somehow the museum can be seen from this moment as a kind of symbol of richness. One of the symbols, not the only one, but then definitely each time a country wants to show that it reached a specific way, it's normal, I guess. Okay, we'll see. Each time you see that a certain country reached a specific amount of wealth, they start to work on their network of museums, and it starts to grow. So if we take the statistics from the years 1930s and the years 2012, this is a table that I prepared for an article. The statistics were done for an international exhibition in 1930. And I tried to calculate the number of museums. What is interesting is to see that in 1937, European museums were the 3/4 of the museum in the world. 75% of the museums were in Europe. The total number of museums in the world at that moment was more or less more than 6,000. Now, they should be, but you should be just careful with the statistic, they should be among 80,000. It might be also 100 and maybe even more than 100,000 museums in the world. But if we take the statistics, the figure 80,000 museums in the world, you could see that it still continues to be a Western phenomenon, especially a Western phenomenon, but of course also more and more an American one. About 47, mainly 50% of the museum statistics are located in North America. The rest, 41%, are located in Europe. And you see that for the moment, at least, the number of museums in Asia continues to be very small, especially if you compare it with the number of visitors and the number of people, of the inhabitants. And of course, also, even though there are some national committees, the number of museums in Africa, or of course also in Oceania, but in Oceania there are not so many inhabitants. In Africa is mostly null. If you just concentrate on the most important museums, the most popular museums, you would just see that all of them are not located in Africa, nor in Oceania, nor in Latin America, but on the eastern coasts of the United States, on Great Britain, some in France, one actually in St. Petersburg, in Russia, and some others in China. It means something. It means that still the museum movement, although it is, of course, a world phenomenon, is still very much connected with the Western idea of how is the world, etc. If you do concentrate This is a statistic with museums that are welcoming more than 1 million visitors a year. Art museum, not science museums, just the art museums. Following the art newspaper, there would have been more than 65 museums. Most of them are located in North America and Europe. But here I also took a kind of other category, speaking about the Anglo-Saxon countries, which means, of course, Canada, North America, and Great Britain, and the Latin countries, which are Latin America and France, Spain, and Italy, and Greek, because there is one, at least one museum with more than 1 million visitors in Athens, and Asian countries, and the German and Slavistics, I would say. What is interesting is to see that somehow, and I'm very interested about that, somehow the Anglo-Saxon museums are dominating the statistics. If you consider these most important museums, if you even consider the global population, you would see also that the Anglo-Saxon museums, British and United States, are really dominating the statistics also. But if you take also the cyber visitors, the visitors through internet, because more and more it starts to be important to look at museums and to visit museums not only with your foot, but also with your mouse or with a laptop or with your phone. Then if you just look at the statistics concerning Twitter and Facebooks, and if you consider the museums that have more than 250,000 followers or friends, you would say also that then, at that moment, the very vast majority of these museums on internet are located in Great Britain and United States. What does it mean? It means actually that the way of conceiving museum, the global discourse on museums, is very much and is still very much influenced by the Anglo-Saxon way of considering museum, of defining museums, etc. If you do this with the museological literature, you would observe exactly the same, which means actually that the way of conceiving the evolution of museum, but also the history and the way of museum functions, most of the literature, most of the way of seeing them are coming from Great Britain and especially also United States. That might explain also, that is at least one of the reasons why all of these global way of considering museum, why museums are so interesting. Because they contribute, of course, not to the hard power of countries. The hard power is, of course, the army, the power of the army. But what one of the American thinkers who worked with Bill Clinton in the 90s, which is Joseph Nye, called the soft power. Soft power is the way of persuading, a kind of way of considering public relation of a country in order to apply your ideas, in order to change minds. What was the idea and the idea behind this is that actually if you want to rule the world, you cannot have only the power of the army, you cannot have only hard power, you need also a soft power. Actually, Romans could work and could win the battles, But if they wanted to stay in the antiquity, they needed also some institutions to be there and to be accepted. And there are a lot of tools used in order to be accepted and to accept this type of domination, I would say. Among all of these institutions, you could think about museums, because museums give, with the possibilities of propaganda through exhibitions, through the way they consider and they teach history, of course, can explain, they can participate, of course, to this, to one of the tools used by soft power. Among the other tools, of course, universities. And you know how universities are also used by countries. By inviting not only teachers in order to speak, but also by inviting students, giving grants in order to study abroad. It was, of course, the case for USSR. It was, of course, the case for Americans to offer some grants in order to study in United States, in order, of course, to form new elites of other countries to cooperate with America. But it was exactly the same with France, it was exactly the same with Great Britain, etc., etc. All of these, the states, use this type of power. All of the states use the type of Alliance Française, Instituto Cervantes, Goethe-Institut, all of these national institutions behind that try to influence and to teach the languages, etc. Confucius institutions in China, etc. One of the very and the most powerful tools for soft power, of course, is cinema. The idea of Disney, and the reason why cinema is such an important thing for for American industry, why cinema wanted to, why the Americans wanted to put cinema in the agreements of the World Organization of Trade, was, of course, first because it was a very important industry, but second also that it was such a powerful tool for showing the American way of life. And it was, of course, used by all of the other countries. But we know also that US cinema is the biggest cinema in the world. Some of the battlegrounds of this soft power, some of the neutral battlegrounds of this soft power can be conceived as playgrounds where all of the nations fight together, but not with weapons, such as Olympic Games, such as the World Cup, and somehow also, of course, with universal exhibition. This is a picture, of course, very well known from the Paris International Exhibition of 1937. At that moment, actually, there was an exhibition on museography. One of the very first exhibitions on museography was at that exhibition. And this was the place where I took the statistics that I showed you. And you know also that this was the Soviet pavilion, but Germany had an idea of the architecture of the Soviet pavilion. So Albert Speer, who was the architect of the German pavilion, built this pavilion in order to show the idea that the eagle was stopping the Soviet power. All of the universal exhibitions are also places for confrontations with peace, with a kind of friendship, but also, of course, with a type of confrontation. Of course, all of these tools were used during all of the periods, and museums were used through exhibitions, through internal exhibitions, through foreign exhibitions, traveling exhibitions, in order to show the wealth of a certain countries, etc. One of the very most interesting operation of the CIA during the Cold War was the help of CIA through Rockefeller Foundation in order to finance a new way of showing art, which was contemporary art, which was called art for freedom, etc. And the way of how culture, how symposiums were financed and were used during the Cold War in order to convince especially Western Europe not to join the communist part of Europe was very important at that moment. This is a story that started to be discovered during the last decades, actually, and for a lot of intellectual and French intellectual, it was a very big surprise to learn that all of the symposium showing and organizing in order to say that there were some people who were not leftist, but who were also intellectual from the right parties. Most of these were financed by the CIA. Was a kind of a brutal revelation. Of course, most of the works of art were also used for diplomacy. This is a very old and classical ways of using traveling exhibition. You recognize, of course, the Gioconda. You know also that the very first time she traveled was for United States, and at that moment it was in order to show that France was thankful to United States, but they wanted to position, etc. France at that time was using a lot culture as its power for diplomacy also. André Malraux at that moment was a very important representative of this idea of culture, of French culture. At that moment, this idea of French culture was still a possibility for France, which was not anymore a military power, which was not anymore a very rich country, but it was still a kind of very important cultural power in order to be shown to the rest of the world and to have its word to say in the conflict at that moment. So if the museums are supposed to play a role in a kind of public relation of nations, they can also play a role, a direct role, concerning the development of the economy. The most important agent for this, the most well-known, is the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao that was opened in 1997 and that proved to be a success, a huge success, which means that in a city where mostly nobody would go, Bilbao, it's not the funniest city in the world actually, because of the Guggenheim Museum, more than 1 million of tourists were coming to visit the museum and the new face of the city because there were some urban revolutions, etc. This idea of having museums in order to develop a region or a city started to spread around the world. It started in the 80s, but because of Bilbao, mostly every politician for a major city wanted to renovate its museum, thinking that we could have a part of the tourist industry. You know, actually the tourist industry is one of the growth industry in the world, one of the most prosperous actually. There are more than 1 billion tourists in the world each year, and there were mostly a couple of millions of tourists in the 50s. So the growth of tourism started also to be exponential. This is a schema that explains how it would evolve. We are more or less here, and it's supposed to continue and to continue, which means that, of course, because they start to be richer, Asian people, Chinese people, also Russian people, Brazilian people, people from South Africa, Indian people. When you have a middle class of a huge country that starts to be wealthy enough in order to travel, it means that tourism is growing and growing, which means actually that it generates a huge amount of money. If the Louvre is the most visited museum in the world with more than 10 million people, it's not because they are just French visitors. Actually, there are not so many French visitors. It's because there are 85, I would say at least 80% of tourists. And it means also that if the tourist industry continue to grow, the population of visitors at the Hermitage also actually, but in the Louvre, in the Metropolitan Museum, in the British Museum, will continue to grow up and to grow and to grow. That's the reason why the Louvre is already calculating how it could welcome 15 million visitors, because it might happen if it continues like this. And of course, if you consider that each tourist would spend more than between, I would say, 150 and 250 euros or $200, $250 a day, if they can stay 1, 2, 3 days, you may understand that what means 1 million tourists. A huge amount for the economics of a city. Not only for the museum, but for the whole region. That's the reason why the Bilbao Museum was supposed to have created more than 3,000 or 4,000 new jobs in the region. Because all of these economic development, because of the influence of tourism through museums, through international exhibitions, etc. Unfortunately, only for the biggest museums. The biggest museums will be bigger and bigger, but the small museums and the medium museum will normally not get really the results of these developments. The second point, how museum could participate to the economic development of a city, is linked with a theory which is linked with the creative economy and the creative class. Richard Florida, in the beginning of the 21st century, developed the idea that the new class, which is the most important, the new social class, which is the most important in order to attract, is not the labor class. It's not the class that is linked with services, nor agriculture, but what he was calling the creative class, which were people working in creativity, advertisements, softwares, Google, Facebook, GAFA, etc., Baidu, and all of these new technologies, all of the new jobs that are offered by the Silicon Valley and some other places. And he calculated what were the reason why some of these people wanted to stay in a region. Because the cities where they were, for instance, very tolerant concerning gender problems, etc. But also because of the creative institutions that they were, especially cultural institutions, and also especially museums, contemporary art museums, etc. So it meant that if you want to show to the rest of a region or of a country that you are a magnificent place which is full of attractiveness, the idea of building a museum in order to say, well, we are new, started to emerge. And of course, it was the case with the Bilbao city. It was the case with a lot of other countries, with a lot of medium-sized cities, For instance, in France, in Lyon, there were some very important new projects linked with museum. In Lyon, it was the Musée des Confluences. In Metz, it was an annex of the Centre Pompidou, which was created there with a beautiful architecture. And the idea was saying, okay, we have this wonderful architecture, we have these wonderful infrastructures. We show you that you would be very well at that place to work. Why do they want to do this? Because actually, these people, the people who would go there, this creative class, they have a lot of beautiful taxes to pay. And of course, a competition started to emerge between different cities in order to attract these most important inhabitants, these wealthy citizens. Because actually it's a competition. If one region succeeds to attract some of these citizens, the other region will not. And actually, it happens also with the cultural capitals. During more than 100 years, Paris was definitely the capital, the cultural capital of the world during the whole 19th century until somehow the 1950s. And then New York became the cultural capital. First because it was a very wealthy city, and then also because of the idea of modern art, etc. But then actually, it was also a kind of strategy. And it means actually that if you look closely at all of these most important capitals, such as London, such as Milano, such as Rome, such as also Shanghai, such as, of course, St. Petersburg, etc. All of them are, all of these capitals, all of these very big cities are making some competitions with the other most important cities in order to become one of the biggest hubs in the world. For the moment, New York is still the cultural capital of the world, somehow, with the art market, with a lot of museums, with a lot of boutiques, fashion boutiques, etc., etc. But which one will be the next capital? Shall it be in Shanghai, in China? Shall it be in India? Where could it be? All of the cities are trying to regenerate themselves. And of course, they use museums for this reason. Which means actually that if you, as a curator, if you run a museum, and if you think that the city is financing your museum because it finds that it's good for heritage preservation or education, etc., well, maybe it's a mistake. Somehow, it means that the main reason why people are financing museums is for symbols, it's for attracting tourism, it's for developing the economy of a region, and definitely not for research. And certainly not even actually for education, and sometimes even not for heritage preservation. Last point that is linked with geopolitics and with the game that all of the nations are playing somehow in our world is the link between museums and armed conflicts. Museums were always behaving during the other parts of my speech passively or actively, but in a pacific way. Somehow they can act also as propaganda, as propaganda machine, but they can also play a role of depository of trophies, of wars and war trophies. This is a photo of the military museum in Paris during the First World War, which shows in the inner court all of the guns and planes that were taken to German people, to the German army We were in 1916, it was during the war. And of course, all of these museums and all of the museums at that moment and during all the wars, all of the museums are participating actively through exhibition to, of course, the success of the world. But then were, of course, exposing the trophies. This is a very old tradition, of course. It started in the antiquity and it continued. But actually, the museum participated a lot to this activity from, I would say, the 18th century, especially during the Napoleon Wars. This is a huge vase from the Sèvres Museum that shows the arrival of statues that were kept that were taken from Rome, from the Roman collections. There were some paintings that were taken from Germany, from Belgium, well, at least the Belgian region, of course, then from Italy, and they arrived in a triumph. There was a triumphal arrival of all of these statues. You see, they were exposed, and of course, they were showing. They were shown in the Louvre until 1815, as the Louvre was conceived as the capital, the museum of the capital of freedom. So art was freedom, and then the capital of freedom was, of course, the home of the new, all the arts in the world. So, of course, the most beautiful treasures of antiquity should be in Paris at that moment. Of course, when Napoleon lost the war, all of the treasures had to leave France, and it was a disaster for some of the painters and the inhabitants of Paris, but of course a very big pleasure for all of the people from Italy, etc. But of course, with the colonial expansions, with the British and the French empires especially, all of the ethnographic museums started to have exactly the same reflex, the same idea of receiving all of these trophies. Some of them were offered by private collectors, but of course they were offered by collectors who plundered these countries before. And some of them were directly also offered to the kings and the museums. For instance, after the looting of the Summer Palace in Beijing in 1860, some very beautiful pieces from that Summer Palace were offered to Napoleon III, the Second Empire, and Eugénie, and they were showed in a specific museum, the Chinese Museum in Fontainebleau. They are still there. They are not asked for the moment by China, but definitely they were there because of plundering the Summer Palace, of looting the Summer Palace. You know that, of course, the practice of looting was very common and continued to be common until, I would say, Second World War. After the Second World War, the attitudes changed because of international law, and specifically because of UNESCO Convention of 1954 that was linked with prevention of cultural goods in armed conflicts. It was totally forbidden to touch to cultural goods, even though we know that for each war there are some destruction, there are some looting. Of course, they are not legal. They are supposed to be totally illegal. We know also that some of the armies continue to do this, but actually also they are definitely not accepted for the moment. But after a while, after maybe one generation, they could also come again to some museums. Somehow, the idea of destroying antiquities, you might have in mind the destruction of ISIS and Taliban during these regimes. The destruction of trophy is also exactly the same idea of having a trophy. as ISIS didn't want to have a kind of such museum, because the relation with object was totally not possible, it was a pleasure for them to destroy them. But it's exactly the same. Showing or destroying somehow are totally opposed, but they have the same idea behind them. Then, of course, if you think about looting, of taking things, you think also, after a while, when you lost the war, to restitute and to give back. This is what happened with Napoleon after 1815. He was forced to give back all of the works of art that were taken to the Louvre. But it was because Napoleon was defeated, totally defeated. Actually, the restitution is also a very clear idea of showing the power of one country from another one. If you accept to restitute, it might be because the country is bigger than yours, or because you have some economic reasons to do it. If Greece had been bigger or had a bigger army, maybe the Parthenon marbles wouldn't be anymore in Great Britain, because of course there are a lot of legal reasons why it stays or why it should go, etc. But somehow the real things behind these is the fact that Greece is a small country, which is actually a poor country, and that Great Britain is not. When France, which hated to restitute things actually, and especially they said always that the law, the national law, says that the regime the regime of the collection is inalienability, which means that you cannot take out an object from the collection. All of the objects of national museums must stay in the museum collection for years, for decades, or for centuries. Actually, there were some exceptions. Each time there were some exceptions, there were not so many, actually. It was because of power relation. When France wanted to sell some TGV to Korea, they sent back some manuscripts that were taken to another episode that were taken during the Korean War, where the French army looted a very important king depot, and actually it was in the 19th century. Of course, Korea asked for its restitution, and during a long time, France didn't want to do anything with this. But when after they wanted to sell some huge trains, TGV, very important contracts, economic contracts, President Nicolas Sarkozy decided to give back some of these manuscripts. Of course, all of the curators were totally afraid and pissed off about this, but they were forced. Well, actually, it was not specially given back. They were supposed to be for a very long loan, long-term, very, very long-term loan, but actually they are in Korea, and it's because actually only for economic reasons. There's a reason why actually the idea of restitution that was given, that was decided by Emmanuel Macron 2 years ago. He made a very important speech in Ouagadougou, in Africa, saying that African heritage should be given again, should stay in Africa, and that European museums should give again to Africans their heritage. Of course, it was very much applauded by all of the people from Africa. Of course, all of the curators from France were thinking that he was totally mad, and they were totally opposed to that. But somehow, we can just ask ourselves why. Is it because Emmanuel Macron is a humanist? We might think about it, but I'm not sure. I would never be sure that a politician is a humanist somehow. It might happen, but it's very rare, I would say. Definitely, it might be also for political reasons. It's, of course, does not cost so much. It's a very symbolic gesture. Africa is full of contracts. All of the African countries that used to be the French Empire, and they were under the influence of France during a long time after the decolonization. There were a lot still of contracts and French industries working in these countries. Actually, most of these French industries are losing all of their countries. Why? Because of Chinese new industries, new companies, etc. And France is losing its authority in some of these regions. A way of keeping and trying to get again some of its influence is linked with all of these type of influences through cultural heritage somehow, through the launching of new museums. It's not a hazard that China built a huge museum in Senegal, as far as I remember, in Dakar, which for the moment is mostly empty, saying, okay, you should fill it with some of the restituted things, etc. It's also a gift from China, but all of these cultural gifts are also linked with these diplomatic things and diplomatic ways of considering policy in general. So, in conclusion, what I would say is the fact that provided you would be rich or having a big army, but especially if you are the richest, this is a map showing the countries and the size of the countries with their national product. You mean, of course, you can see, of course, that the biggest one and the biggest influence is still linked, of course, with Europe and especially, of course, United States. But then, of course, Asia is starting to be growing bigger and bigger. Except Brazil, the biggest part of Latin America and of course also Africa are so small that they are mostly absent on this map. Then the question actually is linked with the future. If you consider all of what I said and you think about the future with a new center that would not be America anymore, but would be linked with China, India, etc., you might also realize that the idea of the museum within the new decades would change dramatically. Because each time a country tried to rule and to dominate and to keep a kind of supremacy on the other ones, history learns us that the idea of the museums is also influenced by this. The number of museums could grow and could continue to grow, but the idea of museum could also evolve radically. Or maybe even disappear, as somehow the museum was a Western invention, and even though in China there are some, and in Asia there are some museums, there used to be some huge collections and the art of collecting since the antiquity, the idea itself of the museum might change radically. It might also change because of all our industry and all of the evolution of our world. You know, as I explained it, as our world is really linked with some natural resources such as oil. You know that oil is at the centrum of a lot of wars. You know also that oil is a finished product, and there might be a kind of end of the oil, which would be maybe for the next decades. Which means, as some people are forecasting that some of our civilization could also disappear. And of course, if a civilization disappears, it means that the population declines, etc. But of course, also the institutions disappears, and some of the institutions, such as museums. But after all, this idea was already invented and proposed by Hubert Robert in the 18th century, and it's a very romantic idea. Thank you very much.
When you were speaking about the soft power concept, you mentioned that museums can be instruments of such soft power through exhibitions, maybe other projects abroad. But do you think what will be the most effective ways of such soft power in relation to museums? Exhibitions showing traditional art, maybe one more exhibition of icons, or contemporary art to show the better image of the country as progressive and contemporary art sphere. And maybe it might be some conceptual exhibition showing some political idea.
Actually, if you think about the idea of soft power when you visit a museum, I think it's very stimulating because even for art museum, when you visit a museum, you have a lesson of art history, which means that if you visit the Hermitage, you have a lesson of art history through the Hermitage. If you visit the Louvre, you have a specific lesson of art history, which is the French vision of art history, which means if you visit the Louvre, that French art is at the centrum, and Latin art, etc., which is totally different if you visit the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, where, for instance, German art is very important, when Rubens is really at the centrum. And of course, also, if you look at the museums in United States, you would also have a specific way of conceiving art history. Of course, for what concerns art history, it's one lesson of art history. It means also something. Of course, when you consider just history in general, the way of showing what is history is amazing. I visited the museum the different museum of Nanjing. You know the Nanjing massacres. There were some, what is called the Nanjing massacres. There is a huge memorial of the Nanjing massacres because there were supposed to be 300,000 Chinese people who were killed by Japanese. That memorial of Nanjing massacres is visited by 8 million people who received this idea that the Nanjing massacres were terrible, etc. And this is the general idea that circulates. If you go to Tokyo, and if you visit the War History Museum, you hear about the Nanjing events. And of course, the story is totally different. If you visit if you had visited the Museum of American History in the 70s, it would have been totally different version of history that you would have gotten in that museum that in Soviet museums, of course, also. Each time when you visit a museum, you have a certain version of the facts that is given. What is very interesting is the topic, is the point that museums, for the moment, are among the most trusted institutions. There were a lot of surveys that were made in different countries, in Great Britain, in France, etc., showing, asking people, what is trustable? Newspaper? Oh no, newspaper are not trustable anymore for the moment. Television is not trustable anymore. But libraries, archives, and museums are conceived as places where you could get the real facts. And it is very interesting because if you have this in mind, that for the people, when they go in a museum, they go and they see and they get the real facts. They go to see the real things and they get the real facts somehow. But actually, this is just a version. And, well, during the war, most of the museums were making some very easy to see propaganda exhibitions. Even at the Museum of Modern Arts, there were some amazing and very beautiful, very beautifully done propaganda exhibitions of war and on war. But then actually, even in peaceful time, you have some other versions of what is power, what is the power in the region, etc. So on that level, you have already a very important level of soft power. Second, I would say there is a second level, which means, which is the idea that if the museum reflects the richness of a region or a city, of a nation, etc. Which means that for all of the tourists that who visit a museum, they get an idea of what is the richest part of what is shown, etc. When you go to St. Petersburg and you see all of the beautiful buildings and the wonderful museums, etc., you understand what is the power, what is a certain idea of a concentrated power, because actually heritage and the heritage of the museum collection is a concentrated idea of the national project that was accumulated during centuries and centuries with collectors that gave collections, etc. It means, it gives a kind of specific idea of the power, the riches, the level of culture of a city. Which means that each time you visit a place, you may be influenced, even without knowing it, but you are influenced. And this participates actually to the soft power, because you can manipulate also the way people are visiting.
Thank you so much indeed for your very good presentation. Actually, I'm interested in your topic from a point of view of geopolitics. And what do you think of this? I'm completely in agreement with your point about movement eastwards of these museums, new museums, and weight of new museums. But what do you think of direction to the Persian Gulf? I mean, this opening of new Louvre Museum in Abu Dhabi. What it means? Thank you.
Okay, very interesting question. Actually, this is a very small concentrate of a bigger course that I give actually, and that I prepare in one of my seminars in Paris. And of course, I'm speaking also of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, because actually, of course, it's exactly the, well, it's not exactly, but it's mostly the same as the Guggenheim. But definitely, for what concerns the Louvre, you might know that the Louvre in Abu Dhabi was definitely not the idea of the Louvre itself. It was because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Quai d'Orsay in France, was in discussing with Abu Dhabi, and they had in mind that the Louvre could do this. The Louvre was really reluctant because they thought that they did not have enough collections to share. Actually, the collection of the Louvre is just 300,000 items. I know that in St. Petersburg you have 3 million, so you might make a lot of more small heritage museums than the Louvre. But somehow, it meant that for the Louvre and for France, it was a possibility of showing what was the French spirit of conceiving museums, etc. That's the first point. And of course, French people, this is not very politically correct what I will say, but I will say it. French people thought that it was because the genius of France that they were asked about that. But my point is that Abu Dhabi didn't want only American propositions. So they asked to the Guggenheim and they asked to others, but they wanted to have some other ways of conceiving things. So they asked to the Louvre because they knew also that it could be possible. And it's very interesting because the reaction of most people in France were saying, oh, this is silly to have these things. Of course, it will give a lot of money to the Louvre, and actually it gives a lot of money to the Louvre. But because you know that the idea behind Abu Dhabi was also to make a kind of touristic hub in order to create a new touristic region there. And most of the reaction of the Europeans, especially French people, was saying, oh, Abu Dhabi, this is too far away, etc. But if you just look carefully on a map, you realize that actually Europe is not at all the people who are linked with the Abu Dhabi. But these are the Asian people. Because actually, Abu Dhabi is much more connected with markets. You know that you have the biggest shopping malls in Abu Dhabi. I think it's the biggest one is in Abu Dhabi. It's and as far as I remember, the traffic in this mall is something like 50 million people a year. It's a huge mall and a huge of business for them. So some of the museums are just in France. We have this expression, the cherry on the cake, beautiful decoration and kind of points of attraction to say, okay, not only I'm going to make some shopping. So it's the same. You are not going to say, I'm not just going to Paris in order to go to Euro Disney. You also go to the Louvre, and then you might go also to Euro Disney. But it means also that for Abu Dhabi, they had this global policy where actually the tourists that were maybe located were more in India or in other countries in Asia, and certainly maybe also in China, in Asia definitely, than in France or Europe, etc. So, for instance, definitely, Abu Dhabi is a very beautiful case study in order to see how a country look at all of its problems. We are again in the business of oil, of course, in a region which is very difficult to understand because of all of the oil conflicts, etc., and which starts to grab another influence. And you know that a lot of different countries try to play a very important regional role, such as Saudi Arabia, for the moment, which starts a huge action of propaganda, also building a lot of new museums and trying to develop its tourist industry. But also, of course, Abu Dhabi, but also, not too far, of course, the role of Iran that wanted to become and to get a leadership, etc. So if you have in mind all of these ideas, all of these characteristics, I think you get a better understanding of the role of the Louvre. But if you just believe that it's for the genius of French curators, then I think, well, it should be a mistake.
Dear профессор Мерес, это, конечно, очень здорово, что количество музеев возрастает в экспоненциальной прогрессии, что сотни миллионов людей могут посещать музеи, что свидетельствует об экономическом росте. Хотя связать напрямую, сказать, что культурные достижения прямо пропорционально экономическим, пожалуй, будет довольно сложно. Поэтому скажите, пожалуйста, не видится ли вам опасности в том экспоненциальном росте, о котором вы говорили? И не кажется ли вам, что некая девальвация музея, безусловно, происходит? Диалектика говорит о том, что не бывает никаких процессов, у которых есть только одна сторона. Что вы думаете по этому?
It's a very interesting and difficult question to answer, but it's a very interesting one. Actually, when I showed, I should try to keep it. No, I would not have it. There was a kind of exponential growth, and we all know that it cannot work and continue like this, which means, which means that once there will be something like a decline. And actually, well, that is very logic somehow, that there will be a decline. The most terrible is the fact that most of the curves concerning the consumptions of natural resources have exactly the same curve. It's exactly the same with tourism, as you remember, but it's exactly the same also with oil consumption, water consumption, etc., gas consumptions, etc. And we know that, of course, the material resources are finished, most of them at least, such as oil, gas, etc., which means that we know that will be a decline of consumption, and that once this should be a curve that could continue like this. But of course, it might be exactly the same with museums somehow. But it's also linked with all of the other characteristics I used in my talk somehow. It might be also linked with the general decline of the civilization, which was also based on this exploitation of natural resources, etc. That's the first point. A second point, of course, is, and you are totally right to say it, that there is no direct link between culture and economic growth somehow. It's more, I would say, indirect. At least there are some exceptions of cultural, well, very rich countries with no such cultural aspects. What I might say is that, at least for what concerns the museums, and I would never make a generalization, but what I could observe for museums is the fact that each time after an important region or a country reach something like a very important level on economic growth, there were some institutions that were linked with this that symbolized this economic growth. It's exactly how it was with United States. It happened also with the new regimes after the First World War. It's happened with Korea. It happened in Japan. Somehow it happened also in China. What is interesting is the fact that most of these museums are not visited somehow. Some of these museums, for instance, in China, are very well frequented. There are a lot of visitors, but sometimes there are no visitors, and there is no exhibitions also. It means that somehow you are really in a symbol. If you want to show to the rest of the world that your country is successful, you will, and it's exactly how it happened with Brazil, for instance. Brazil, in the beginning of the 20th century, you remember, with Lula, at that moment, Brazil was a very important, gained a very important growth. There was a huge growth, and actually, at a certain moment, in 2007, the Brazilian tourists were the most important foreign tourists, or the second most important foreign tourists in the Louvre, which was incredible somehow, to see so many Brazilians, because at that moment there were not so many Americans because of terrorism, etc. And actually, at that moment also, Brazil succeeded to win, to welcome the Olympic Games and to welcome the Football Cup, the World Cup. It doesn't mean actually that they won it, actually. But they succeeded to have, and actually the number of museums also started to grow very much. So it means that you have at least the development of the infrastructures, the institutions that celebrate the richness of the country. It doesn't mean that it's the culture somehow, or at least it's another part. It might happen, but definitely with a gap, I would say, of maybe 20, maybe more years. At the beginning, for instance, United States were known at the beginning of the 20th century as the most important and the richest country. They had the biggest general gross product. They succeeded to be the first one at the end of the 19th century, as far as I remember. But at that moment, they were considered as a kind of underdeveloped culture. So they invited a lot of people, there were some generation of foreign teachers, of foreign artists, etc. They sent some artists in all around the world, and so on. 20 years later, at least, the American museums were among the very best ones and were very influential. And most of them, for instance, of the people, of the curators from France or from Great Britain were very much impressed by the quality of the museums and by the quality of the ideas that were different. But then it took again maybe 20 years in order for all countries to recognize, for instance, that there were some real philosophers in the United States. And even philosophers such as Dewey, were considered during, as far as I know, between the two world wars, as a kind of very medium and very low philosophers, not very remarkable compared to other ones. If now you see how American philosophy is considered, how if you take a lot of different rankings concerning universities, concerning Nobel Prizes, concerning inventions, concerning standards of cultures, concerning philharmonic orchestras, etc., you see how important is United States for all of this. So it's a very long building of things somehow. And sometimes also it doesn't happen for some regions that started a kind of building, but all of the ingredients were not there at that moment. It was the case for Brazil on the beginning of the 20th century, where there were some huge richness because of the UVA, caoutchouc, rubber, commerce, trade, and there were some huge, beautiful operas that were built, etc. But this did not mean that culture started to explode and there was a specific culture. It took longer and longer, of course. So there might be it's much more complicated to culture. But definitely for what concerns the institution and the infrastructure, I mean the economic way of building signs and symbols of culture, it's much easier somehow than ideas.